event, one that even professional historians have assumed determined both the shape of our national institutions and all the significant outcomes of our national development before the Civil War. With so much writing on it, scholarly discussion of 18th century American history has necessarily been dominated by concern over the fundamental character of the Revolution and, perforce, its origins. In the mid-1970s, when I was in graduate school, much of what early Americanists debated in one way or another related to the motivations of the revolutionaries. Were they fundamentally driven by material interests or by ideological concerns? It was a big question then, and remains a powerful one even now that it has achieved a scholastic, not to say sterile, maturity. By the late 1980s, when I undertook this project, the question had generated distinctive lines of interpretation that framed the ways historians explained 18th century America almost as decisively as Vauban's magnificent fortifications framed 18th century military campaigns. On one hand, the left ran the works of those scholars, descendants of the progressive historians, who argued that the class interests of Americans stimulated both a movement for independence and an internal struggle over the forms of government to be imposed in the new United States. For neo-progressive scholars, the Revolution was an intensely human process, rooted in the experience of social inequity and in a democratic striving against privilege. Concerned as they were with colonial social relations and economic conditions, the neo-progressives focused less frequently on the great men of the Revolution than on ordinary people, farmers, artisans, laborers, women, and such dispossessed or marginalized groups as blacks, Indians, and the poor. Looking to the opposite side of the field, one could see arrayed the intellectual fortifications of those numerous historians, sometimes called neo-Whigs, who believed that Republican political ideas determined the allegiance and the actions of the revolutionary generation. Their revolution, while not bloodless, was most importantly an ideological and ironic one. Ideological because it followed from the shared belief that powerful men had always sought, and would always seek, to deprive their fellow citizens of liberty and property. Ironic because in the conservative act of defending their liberties and estates, the decidedly elitist gentlemen who articulated the Revolution's ideals also liberated egalitarian impulses that would produce the most democratic, individualist, acquisitive society in the world. Even in the late 1980s, of course, this military metaphor could hardly be said to depict with literal accuracy the range of scholarly opinion on the late colonial period and its relation to the Revolution. In fact, the positions of scholars fell along a spectrum that ranged from extreme materialism on one hand to an equally extreme idealism on the other. Few subscribed absolutely to a single kind of explanation, although most, if pressed hard enough, would have preferred one end of the spectrum over the other. No matter what their interpretative preferences, however, what most historians assumed without disagreement was a common starting point, and that was the problem I had in mind when I began this study. Virtually all modern accounts of the Revolution begin in 1763 with the Peace of Paris, the great treaty that concluded the 7 Years' War. Opening the story there, however, makes the imperial events and conflicts that followed the war, the controversy over the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act crisis, into precursors of the Revolution. No matter how strenuous their other disagreements, most modern historians have looked at the years after 1763 not as contemporary Americans and Britons saw them, as a post-war era vexed by unanticipated problems in relations between colonies and metropolis, but as what we in retrospect know those years to have been, a pre-revolutionary period. By sneaking glances, in effect, at what was coming next, historians robbed their accounts of contingency and suggested, less by design than inadvertence, that the independence and nationhood of the United States were somehow inevitable. With the assumption of inevitability came the desire to fix the original character of the revolutionary controversies in radical or conservative impulses. The more I thought about this problem, the more I became convinced that an alternative understanding might flow simply from beginning the story a decade earlier. Examining the period from a perspective fixed not in 17